Welcome to U.S. Secret Agenda YouTube channel. On the 8th day of the hot conflict in Ukraine, a great human tragedy continues to be experienced in the shadow of the bombardments in the region. The Russian army continues to move towards the city centers and has managed to take down the first major city. At the same time, it wants to break the resistance in the city centers with the support of the bombardment. In addition, Russian troops were gaining ground in critical areas of the south, threatening to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea ports. With the occupation of the city center of Kherson, the first large settlement of the Crimea fell. It is stated that the government building in Kherson has been seized by Russian forces. This is seen as the first successful move of steps taken to cut off Ukraine's connection to the Black Sea, which Russia has been planning for a long time. At the same time, statements came from Mariupol, one of the important port cities. The city's mayor said in a statement that Russian troops had surrounded the southern Ukrainian port city of Mariupol and that the shelling had cut off electricity, water and heat to the people. Further west, just north of Kherson, Russian forces were advancing towards another city, Mykolaiv. Military experts say capturing these cities would cut off the connection of Ukrainian forces fighting Russia-backed separatists in eastern Ukraine from the rest of the country. It is seen that there is a major disruption in the current mobility of the kilometers-long Russian convoy advancing to Kiev. According to British intelligence officials, the strong resistance of the Ukrainian armed forces caused serious mechanical failures and blockages in the convoy. At the same time, the Ukrainian armed forces are destroying Russian battleships in many regions. Ukraine's Spec Ops forces destroyed another 10 enemy IFVs at Gostomel. Special forces of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense destroyed 10 more enemies in the town of Gostomel, which is home to Antonov Airfield near Kyiv. This was reported with reference to the press service of the main intelligence directorate. Special forces of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine destroyed another 10 enemy BMDs at Gostomel, the report says. The battle for control over the city of Gostomel continues. In the statement, it was stated that as of 1830, 10 enemy combat vehicles had been destroyed in the area where a local glass factory is located. The war is being waged by a consolidated group of special forces units led by the GUR and the local resistance groups they train. In total, special forces announced that they had shot down 20 enemy combat vehicles in the same town during the day. Ukrainian citizens, on the other hand, are trying to block Russian tanks with their bodies and bicycles. A stunning video from Bakhmut, Ukraine, shows Ukrainian citizens standing in front of Russian tanks trying to block their advance. In the video, tanks can be seen advancing on the roads in Bakhmut, 110 miles northeast of Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. CNN has confirmed the authenticity and location of the video. In addition, the people living in Ukraine began to confiscate Russian military equipment. As part of the rapidly advancing ground war, Russian weapons and vehicles are increasingly falling into the hands of the Ukrainians, some of whom are taking matters into their own hands and pulling out various armor and other combat vehicles. Little is known about the background of these events. It was widely suggested among the public that Ukrainian farmers, in particular, tow these Russian vehicles based on the very open use of farm tractors as tow trucks. It is not clear to what extent these civilians acted on their own initiative, whether they moved the seized or disabled vehicles on behalf of the Ukrainian armed forces or relevant local organizations. It is also possible that the armed forces of Ukraine will use civilian tractors to move captured vehicles and free up military vehicles for more important missions. It is important to note that the armed forces of Russia and Ukraine share a lot of equipment in common with other tools and kits that are broadly similar, as well as certain specific types used by both armies. This gives Ukraine the opportunity to put into service various items of captured Russian supplies, including the BTR-82A wheeled armored personnel carrier. For many observers, the youthful conflict in Ukraine was punctuated by a strange mix of extreme brutality, particularly in terms of battles in an urban setting and utterly surreal scenes. It is not entirely surprising that scenes of ordinary Ukrainians towing Russian combat vehicles resonate with many of the inherent horrors of the collision, easily accessible in near real time. The Ukrainian armed forces also managed to capture a Russian-made ZPRK Panzer S. In the statement made a few hours ago, the Ukrainian army announced the seizure of the Panzer S anti-aircraft missile and weapon system. Initially, the information on this topic was called unreliable, but the armed forces of Ukraine released a video in which it was really possible to identify the Russian-made Panzer S complex. In the video frames, you can see that the complex did not receive any physical damage, but it seems that the combat vehicle was stuck in the mud. At the same time, it is reported that the equipment was taken to the place where the Ukrainian troops were then deployed. Interception of the Panzer S anti-aircraft missile and weapon system can create many problems for conducting a special military operation in Ukraine, because with its capabilities the complex can successfully repel missile strikes and airstrikes. However, experts note that the armed forces of Ukraine does not have specialists who can deal with these weapons, but against the backdrop of the arrival of several thousand mercenaries in Ukraine, including those involved in the war in Libya, it seems likely that mercenaries in the Libyan National Army will be able to successfully use the Panzer S complexes. Landmarks around the world glow blue and yellow to support Ukraine as Russia's offensive on Ukraine continues. Some of the world's most iconic landmarks have been illuminated with blue and yellow, the colors of the Ukrainian flag, to show its support for the country. The Russian Ministry of Defense criticized the Ukrainian government for distributing weapons to civilians, saying it would inevitably lead to accidents and loss of life. The Kyiv nationalist regime is massively and uncontrollably distributing automatic small arms, grenade launchers and ammunition to residents of Ukrainian settlements, Defense Ministry spokesman Major General Igor Konashenkov said on Saturday. The involvement of the Ukrainian civilian population in the conflicts by the nationalists will inevitably lead to accidents and loss of life. He finished his speech. Despite the Russians' claims to the contrary, evidence suggests that civilian infrastructure is under attack. Since the beginning of the attack, reports have stirred news that apartments and kindergartens have been bombed, civilians have been killed, and rockets have been found in residential streets. Social media videos, photos and satellite images analyzed and geolocated by CNN confirm that densely populated areas have been hit by Russian forces several times. European Commissioner for Crisis Management, Yanis Lenarchik, said on Saturday that he condemned in the strongest terms Russia's attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. Konashenkov also reiterated his claims that the Ukrainian army is placing heavy military equipment in civilian areas. Our intelligence data continues to record the deployment of rocket and artillery units by Ukrainian nationalists in residential areas, not only in Kiev, but also in other Ukrainian cities, he said. We call on the Ukrainian people to be conscious, not to succumb to these provocations of the Kyiv regime and not to expose themselves and their loved ones to unnecessary suffering, said Konashenkov. In a statement made by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs today, it was underlined that there is a threat of conflict between Russia and the North Atlantic Alliance. In fact, this statement seems to have been made to prevent the North Atlantic Alliance from helping Ukraine. The Russian army, which is already facing fierce Ukrainian resistance, may be helpless in the face of aid from NATO. Alexander Grushko, deputy head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, said that there is a real risk of conflict with NATO in the fund of a military special operation in Donbass. According to the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Russia expects the alliance not to escalate and to prevent the outbreak of a conflict. Alexander Grushko, the risks of course arise, and of course we are worried about the supply of weapons, all this is very dangerous. There's no guarantee that it won't happen, he said. At the moment, the situation is quite calm, but experts note that NATO may deliberately try not to show its readiness for conflict, especially given the statements of some countries in the military bloc about their intention to transfer offensive weapons to Ukraine. Among other things, there is the possibility that Russia could seize data on NATO's intentions to attack Russia and its allies.